I wanted to start with a really quick and dirty background on what a joint venture is. A lot of you are here, you probably know the Intermountain West joint venture, but I do think it's an important piece of context to set before we get into this whole project and what it's all about. So joint ventures are just a partnership of like-minded groups, whether that's NGOs, landowner groups, agencies, what have you, all who have a shared interest in conservation. JVs really came about in the 80s when we started having some of these really broad regional or continental conservation plans like NAWAMP, when partners realized that we're not going to be able to accomplish these conservation goals if we're not working together, and at the very least, making sure that we're not working at cross purposes. So that's the whole idea of a joint venture, is that we can accomplish more through collaboration than we can by acting alone. So from there, my board tasked me with this project. So what you're seeing on the screen is our problem statement and then our long-term goal for this effort. And essentially what it was is that my board wanted me to work on elevating compelling, positive stories about conservation that highlight the multiple benefits it provides. So we're talking about things here that will matter to people who might not care about wildlife or habitat or anything like that at face value. And the challenge that we face is that as conservation professionals, we're really, really good at talking to people who already share our values, right? These are the people who are our volunteers, our donors, our early adopters. But whenever we go outside of that group of the quote unquote usual suspects, it's a lot more challenging to reach them with messages that they're going to care about. So this whole project focused on misinformation about conservation. It seems like it's happening more and more often. Conservation often has kind of this political target on its back. And we are operating under the premise that if we have new communication strategies that are telling this positive story, communicating how conservation benefits everybody, not just the people who are enrolling in programs, then maybe far down the line, we'll have more people who are willing to stand up in support of conservation and kind of say that, hey, maybe we shouldn't be saying these things and maybe we should continue funding these programs or whatever. So that was the long-term goal, is to think about how we can actively build that network of conservation advocates. So from here, I went into a communications assessment. And the reason I wanted that to be my next step is that it's going to be really hard to build a network of people out in the landscape who are, stepping up for conservation if we don't really know what our own conservation communications network looks like. So my first step in this was to do this assessment of the storytelling landscape. I focused my efforts in Montana and Dakotas with partners of the joint ventures. So, I conducted 20 interviews. I felt pretty good about that, but in the grand scope of things, that is a pretty limited sample size. I am going to give you my results anyway, because I do think it's interesting and I thought it was a really valuable effort. But the whole goal here was just to see, like, who's talking to who, what are you talking about, are you getting your messages through, and what are the results of that? What are some of those like opportunities and challenges in communicating across the landscape? And I will say all this background and the comms assessment and all these things are in the report that Emily mentioned. And I'm pretty sure that'll go out in an email after this presentation. So if you're interested in reading more about that, it is going to be available for you. So I asked everyone a standard list of 10 questions. I'm just going to go through 2 of them that I thought had the most interesting results. So the first that I wanted to give you a summary of is this discussion of barriers and missed opportunities in the communications landscape at large. All of the answers fell into these 2 categories. So the first is capacity issues. I would bet that most of us on the call are dealing with capacity issues in some way, whether that's funding, whether that's staff capacity. Like, oftentimes we barely have the time to do our own job, let alone think about how to be proactive and reaching new audiences or building new networks or stuff like that. So that is going to be an obstacle that's a challenge for all of us to get over. The other one, which is where our discussion is going to focus today, is that a lot of people pointed to a lack of coordination and collaboration in communications. And I think when we look at the conservation landscape at large, we're seeing organizations partnering more than ever. I mean, they're putting in for funding proposals together, they're going in on projects together, but oftentimes we're not seeing that same coordination happening at the communications level. And even in the interviews I conducted, some of the people had never heard of a joint venture, let alone knew that their organization was sitting on the management board. So I do think there's opportunities for us to kind of think about what that integrated communications looks like and how we can do more of that collaborative work. There are certain benefits of having access to a broader communications network that the people I talked to mentioned. Those are things like showcasing the benefits of conservation at a larger scale and with broader audiences, helping partners build relationships with new audiences, and having that unified presence to carry messages. And then the other question I wanted to summarize for you guys was, I asked people, what's the best way that partners can support the work that you're doing? The first is with cross-posting. This is pretty, pretty standard answer. So, just if you see a post, it works with your mission, share it on your own channels, it gets more views. But then again, connecting, this is the one that I wanted to talk about. Almost every single person I talked to mentioned the need for greater connection and coordination in communications. Some people even brought up that they would be really excited to do like a conservation communicators conference or something like that, when people could get together and just see who else is operating in this landscape, what are their tips and tricks, like what's worked, what hasn't, and just have that peer-to-peer learning opportunity. So I would say, again, fairly limited sample size, but there's clearly a desire and a need to find a way to do more of this collaboration in the communications world. So these are just a couple of quotes that I got from my interviews that I thought were kind of fun. So communications among partners is important. We're all in this together, and if we fail, we all fail. There can be a Caribou coffee across from a Starbucks, and that's okay. And then this one I really like, you can have different horses attached to the same hitch as long as they're all pulling in the same direction, and we need to work together as partners to get information out there. So from these interviews, I outlined 2 next steps for the joint ventures that I work with. So the first was playing an active role in facilitating the continuation and development of these communications networks. This made a lot of sense for the joint ventures because it was an identified niche based on the interviews, and because it outlined a lane that the joint ventures could occupy, and where we could assist in something that was a gap in the landscape. The networks that I had engaged with were largely state-specific efforts based in North Dakota and South Dakota. I'm not currently aware of one in Montana, but once we get into the discussion, I'd love to hear if you guys are aware of networks, if you're participating in them, what you think of them, etc. With this, I guess I think about this like if they're going to be more effective if you have some sense of commonality. So it seems like the bigger you get, the harder it will to have that, but maybe that's not true based on your experience. And then storytelling is the other thing that I was going to do for the joint ventures. Just having these networks help us find stories that our partners have already produced so that we can amplify that work and make sure that it is getting some traction. And then also just by participating in those networks, it helps get a better sense of what's happening out there and where there are stories that aren't being told. So we can help elevate those voices, elevate those parts of the landscapes or those projects that aren't getting as much attention. So this is my last slide. I just wanted to get on my soapbox a little bit about networks. I personally see a lot of potential benefit in having communications networks to engage in, but I might be a little bit biased because I'm with the joint ventures and partnerships are kind of our bread and butter. It's like everything that we do. So it's a very natural fit for the joint venture to be very focused on this kind of approach to communications. And I think it's important to realize that we are all representing our own organizations who have their own values, their own missions, their own goals. And we can't just set that stuff aside so that we can do this networking, right? There has to be kind of this balance in terms of what we're putting in and what we're getting out of these kinds of efforts. And then I mentioned capacity earlier. If you have such limited time, how can we make sure that these networks are intentional, they're effective, and they're value added to your position so that it's not just another thing that you have to do, right? No one wants to sit on another Zoom call for an hour and then feel like we didn't really get anything out of it. That doesn't help us in our job. It doesn't help accomplish those larger conservation goals. So I think this is something that we have to be very strategic with and think about what we're actually trying to accomplish. I think at the end of the road, I'm really thinking about communications as a means to achieve social change. It's really hard to figure out how to break into new audiences. It's really hard to figure out how to measure change in behavior as a result of our communications. And so maybe these networks are just a tool so that we can access some of this collective knowledge. Maybe we can solve problems together, and then eventually try to figure out, like, how do we actually get to that shift in culture so that we do have this broader network of people who are engaged and informed and understand when misinformation is happening so that they can share correct information instead. You know, and I think when it comes to networks, like, this is something I started paying attention to maybe a year ago. So I am not an expert by any means. I'm here to mostly ask questions and start discussion and see if this gets any legs with you guys. But I think it's really curious to think about what a really well-formed network could do for collaborative conservation communications. When I started thinking about this, I bought this book, which you probably can't see because I'm screen sharing, but it's called Impact Networks. And it's all about, like, here's how you put together a meaningful network that is goal-oriented and is designed to accomplish something very specific, right? And I think that's what we need to be thinking about, is how can we make this time well spent if we're going to put together a network that we hope is going to help move the needle faster. So I think I'll stop preaching there and just to turn it over for discussion and see how this sits with you guys. What are you thinking about networks? What would make a network a beneficial use of your time? Yeah, I'm just super interested to hear what you think. I'm going to stick around to participate in the discussion. If you have any questions about the report or want to chat about this more, I'm going to be in this position for another 3 weeks and would love to talk to you. So feel free to reach out, and yeah, I'd love to meet, and I will stop screen sharing and stop talking.